Picture this. A lioness is hunting alone on the African savanna. It is dry season. The grass is golden and brittle, and the heat is doing that thing where it makes the horizon shimmer like something from a fever dream. She has been tracking a herd of Arabian oryx for the better part of the morning, and she is hungry in the specific, focused way that apex predators get hungry. Every sense sharpened, every movement deliberate, the entire universe temporarily narrowed down to the distance between her and what she is about to eat. And then she finds the calf, a baby Arabian oryx, tiny, alone, separated from the herd in some moment of chaos that already happened and is already over, completely defenseless, sitting in the dry grass, looking at the approaching lioness with the particular expression of an animal that has not yet learned enough about the world to fully understand what is currently happening to it. The lioness approaches, and then something happens that makes absolutely no biological sense. Something that evolutionary theory has enormous difficulty explaining. Something that wildlife rangers documented happening not once, not twice, but 6 separate times with the same individual lioness and 6 different oryx calves across several years in the Bale Mountains. She doesn't eat it, she sits down next to it, she grooms it, she protects it from other predators, including, in one documented instance, from other lions who presumably thought she had lost her mind, which from a strictly caloric perspective was a reasonable conclusion. She treats it, in every behavioral sense that matters, as if it were her own cub. A lion, one of the most efficient killing machines ever produced by 4 billion years of evolution, voluntarily adopting and protecting an animal that belongs to a species it would normally eat without a second thought. And the question that this raises, the question that has been making evolutionary biologists quietly uncomfortable for decades while they try to find a clean theoretical explanation for it, is deceptively simple. Why? Today we are going deep into one of the most fascinating, most emotionally resonant, and least discussed phenomena in all of animal behavior. Why do animals raise babies from other species? What is happening in the brain of that lioness? What does it tell us about the biology of care, about the ancient human relationship with the animal world, about where the impulse to protect a helpless creature actually comes from? And what does all of this reveal about something much bigger, about what empathy actually is and how old it might really be? The answer involves brain chemistry, evolutionary misfires, ancient human behavior that rewrote the entire trajectory of our species, and at least one moment in this video where you are going to look at the animal world with a completely different kind of recognition. Let's go. Before we get into specific cases, and there are some spectacular specific cases coming, we need to spend a moment on the biological framework that makes interspecies adoption simultaneously understandable and deeply puzzling. Because without that framework, the behavior just looks like animals being weird and wholesome, which is entertaining but not particularly illuminating. Parental care, the investment of time, energy, and resources in offspring, is not free. It is one of the most metabolically and behaviorally expensive things an animal can do. It requires redirecting resources away from the parent's own survival. A nursing mother is burning a significant fraction of additional calories to produce milk. A parent defending offspring is absorbing the risk that would otherwise fall entirely on the young. Every hour of parental care is an hour not spent finding food, not spent resting, not spent on activities that serve the parent's own immediate survival. From a strict evolutionary perspective, this investment only makes sense if the offspring being cared for carries enough of the caregiver's genetic material to make the cost worthwhile in reproductive terms. Your own biological offspring share approximately half your genes. Investing in their survival is directly investing in the survival of your genetic legacy. Nieces and nephews share roughly a quarter. Still enough genetic overlap to justify some investment under certain conditions. Cousins share an eighth. As genetic relatedness decreases, the evolutionary justification for investing in another individual's survival decreases with it. An unrelated member of your own species represents weak justification at best. An unrelated member of a completely different species represents, from the strict evolutionary accounting perspective, essentially zero justification. You share almost none of your genetic material with them. Their survival contributes nothing to your reproductive legacy. The resources you spend on them are resources taken directly from your own survival and from the survival of your actual genetic kin. And yet, it happens regularly enough across enough different species and enough different circumstances that it cannot be dismissed as a curiosity or a statistical anomaly. A dolphin in the waters off Hawaii was documented adopting and nursing a melon-headed whale calf that was not her species. Nursing it, meaning actually producing milk for it and allowing it to feed. A group of capuchin monkeys in Brazil was observed caring for an infant marmoset, a completely different genus of primate, integrating it into their social group and treating it as a genuine member. Bonobos, our closest primate relatives alongside chimpanzees, have been documented adopting infants from different social groups and in some cases from different species entirely. Bald eagles in the United States have been documented adopting chicks from red-tailed hawk nests, including in one case where the eaglet appeared to take on a distinctly older sibling behavioral role toward the significantly smaller hawk chick. King penguins, a species whose chicks are regularly predated by skua seabirds, have been observed defending skua chicks, the predator protecting the offspring of its prey. That is not a small or easily explained behavioral anomaly. The behavior is real. The question of why is genuinely contested. Let's walk through the main scientific explanations because each one illuminates something different about the biology of care, and each one is more interesting than the simple story of animals being confused about which babies are theirs. The first explanation is what researchers call misfired maternal instinct, and it begins with a neurochemical called oxytocin. Oxytocin, sometimes called the bonding hormone or the love hormone in popular science writing, which somewhat undersells the complexity of what it actually does, is a neuropeptide produced in the hypothalamus and released into the bloodstream and brain during social bonding, physical touch, nursing, and childbirth. It is one of the most evolutionarily ancient neurochemicals in vertebrate biology, appearing in functionally similar forms across fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Its core function across all of these species is the same. It facilitates social bonding. It makes other individuals feel important, safe, and worth investing in. In maternal contexts, oxytocin floods the system during labor and peaks during nursing. It is specifically what makes a mother want to stay close to, protect, and invest in her newborn offspring. The physical sensation of nursing triggers additional oxytocin release, which reinforces the bonding behavior in a feedback loop that gets stronger the more it is activated. The system is designed, at the neurological level, to make caring for a newborn feel rewarding, in a way that overrides competing motivations. Here is where the interspecies adoption story begins. This oxytocin-driven care activation system evolved to respond to infant cues, the specific combination of physical characteristics that young mammals across many species share. Large eyes relative to face size, round, oversized head relative to body, small, helpless, uncoordinated body, high-pitched vocalizations. These features, which evolutionary biologists call infantile cues or the baby schema, trigger caregiving responses in adults across a remarkably wide range of species. The system is sensitive to these cues because failing to respond to your own offspring is catastrophically costly from a reproductive standpoint. Natural selection has consistently favored strong, reliable responses to infant cues, but strong and reliable does not mean perfectly discriminating. The same oxytocin system that makes a lioness nurture her own cubs responds to the infantile cues presented by an oryx calf that is small, round-headed, large-eyed, helpless, and vocalizing in a high pitch. The neurological machinery does not come with a species identification verification step built in. It responds to the cues. If a different species infant presents those cues in the right context, at the right hormonal moment, when the female's oxytocin system is already activated or primed, the response can fire in the same way it would for biological offspring. This is not a mistake in the design of the system. It is the system operating at the sensitive edges of parameters that evolution set deliberately wide. Because being slightly over-inclusive in care behavior costs much less than being under-inclusive and missing your own offspring. The second explanation is the practice hypothesis, and it is more interesting and more evolutionarily coherent than the misfiring instinct idea because it actually proposes a fitness benefit for the adopting animal, rather than treating the behavior purely as an error. In many large-brained social species, effective parenting is not entirely instinctive. It is partly a learned skill. A female who has never cared for an infant makes more mistakes, takes longer to respond to infant distress signals, is less effective at keeping young alive in the critical early weeks, and generally produces lower survival offspring than an experienced mother who has been through the behavioral demands of infant care before. If that is true, and the evidence from multiple species including elephant seals, primates, and various birds suggests it is, then the opportunity to practice caregiving before your own biological offspring arrive has genuine survival value for those future offspring. The young, nulliparous female who adopts and cares for an infant of another species Spending weeks or months developing and refining caregiving behaviors may raise her own first biological offspring more effectively than a female who had no prior caregiving experience. From this perspective, the investment in an unrelated infant of another species is not a reproductive loss. It is a training investment that pays forward into the female's actual reproductive career. The adopted infant is essentially a practice baby, not in a callous sense, but in the functional sense that caring for it builds the neurological and behavioral infrastructure for effective maternal care. This explanation fits best when the adopting individual is a young, inexperienced female who does not yet have biological offspring of her own. And interestingly, a significant number of documented interspecies adoption cases do involve young females in exactly this demographic. The pattern is not universal. Experienced mothers also adopt across species in documented cases, but it is frequent enough to be more than coincidence. The third explanation is the reciprocity hypothesis, and it applies primarily to social species where group relationships involve ongoing exchanges of resources and favors over time. In complex social groups, the kind that many primates, elephants, and cetaceans maintain across years and decades, individuals track their relationships with specific group members and calibrate their cooperative behavior based on the history of those relationships. Animals that have helped you in the past get more cooperation from you in the future. Animals that have never helped you get less. The system is not perfectly transactional. It is not a simple ledger. But the general principle that social investment generates future social returns is well supported across multiple social species. In this framework, adopting an orphaned infant, even one from another species in some circumstances, can function as a social investment that generates goodwill, alliance, and future cooperative behavior from the group members who observe and respond to the adoption. A female who takes on the care of a vulnerable infant signals her caregiving capacity, her pro-social orientation, and her willingness to invest in others to everyone in her social group. That signal has social value that can translate into real fitness benefits through the strengthened alliances and cooperative relationships it generates. Now, here is the explanation that researchers find most interesting and most uncomfortable to discuss fully, because it requires acknowledging something about animal cognition that a certain strand of scientific conservatism has historically resisted. Some animals may simply feel something that functions like empathy toward other beings that are suffering or helpless. Behavioral evidence from large-brained social species is increasingly pointing toward genuine emotional responses to the distress of others that exceed what any of the mechanistic explanations can fully account for. Coco, the famous gorilla who learned to communicate through sign language, adopted several kittens across her lifetime, naming them and responding to their deaths with what her caregivers consistently described as visible, prolonged grief. She asked for a cat for her birthday. When her first adopted kitten was accidentally killed by a car, she expressed sadness in signs and displayed behaviors associated with mourning over several days. A gorilla mourning a kitten is not comfortably explained by misfired oxytocin or practice parenting theory. It is comfortably explained by an emotional relationship, by genuine attachment formed through sustained caregiving, that produced genuine grief when the attachment was severed. Whether that constitutes empathy in the full philosophical sense that the word carries in human contexts is a question that researchers debate with appropriate caution. But something is happening in that gorilla's emotional life that produces behavior we would recognize without difficulty as grief. The evidence from wild gorilla populations points in the same direction. When a young mountain gorilla loses its mother, the rest of the social group responds to that loss in observable ways. Other females offer proximity and grooming. Dominant males share sleeping spaces with the orphan. Group members adjust their behavior in response to what appears to be genuine recognition of the orphan's vulnerability and distress. The group is responding to need, to the specific helplessness and grief of a vulnerable individual, in ways that cost the responding individuals real time and energy and that produce no obvious immediate genetic return. If that is not empathy, it is something that produces the same behavioral outputs as empathy across a wide range of circumstances. And the question of where that capacity came from, how old it is, how widely it is distributed across the animal kingdom, turns out to connect directly to the ancient human story. Because ancient humans were not observers of interspecies care behavior. They were participants in it. They were practitioners of it, and the interspecies care that ancient humans extended to other species was not a minor behavioral footnote. It was, quite possibly, one of the most consequential things our species ever did. Ancient hunter-gatherers across multiple continents and multiple time periods consistently showed one specific behavior that researchers studying hunter-gatherer communities from remote areas have documented with striking consistency. They took in young animals from the wild and raised them in camp, not for food necessarily, not for any specific economic purpose that straightforward utilitarian analysis can easily explain. They took in wolf pups, bear cubs, deer fawns, fox kits, baby birds, small primates, whatever young animals they encountered that were helpless and orphaned, and brought them back to camp. They fed them from human food supplies. They let them sleep in human sleeping areas. They formed relationships with them that the animals in turn formed relationships back through. One model for the origin of dog domestication, which genetics places at between 15,000 and 40,000 years ago, making it the oldest domestication event in human history, proposes that ancient hunter-gatherers routinely raided wild wolf dens for pre-weaned pups. These pups were socialized to humans and kept in camp as tamed companions. Pet keeping was a commonplace hunter-gatherer activity, probably derived from the same care impulses that drove ancient humans to care for orphaned human children within their groups. Care impulses so generalized that they extended readily across species lines to any small, helpless, infant-shaped creature that appeared in the right context. This is not a fringe hypothesis. The archaeological evidence for ancient humans burying dogs alongside themselves, with apparent care and intentionality that suggests genuine emotional significance, goes back at least 14,000 years. One of the oldest and most affecting finds is from the Upper Jordan Valley, where archaeologists discovered a human skeleton with its hand resting on the chest of a puppy. The positioning was not accidental. Someone placed that hand there deliberately, or died with it there, in a posture that communicated relationship. That the small animal buried alongside them was not cargo or property, but a companion whose presence in death mattered. 14,000 years ago, someone cared enough about their dog to arrange for them to be together after death. That impulse, to care for another creature, to form a genuine bond with a being that shares none of your genetic material and in many cases none of your species, is not modern. It is not a product of civilization or urbanization or the specific social conditions of the contemporary world. It is ancient. It appears in our behavior long before we invented writing, long before we built cities, long before we developed any of the philosophical or religious frameworks that modern people use to justify and explain their care for animals. Ancient humans picked up wolf pups not because they had calculated the economic returns of early dog domestication. They picked them up because a small, round-headed, large-eyed, helpless creature was there in front of them, and something in their neurology, the same oxytocin-driven infant care system that fired for their own children, responded to it. And they kept the pup, and fed it, and slept next to it. And eventually the pup became something that had never existed before in the history of life on Earth. The first dog. The beginning of a relationship between two species that has outlasted every civilization that has ever risen and fallen in the 14,000 years since. The entire history of human-dog companionship, one of the longest and most emotionally significant relationships our species has ever maintained, began because an ancient human looked at a wolf pup and felt the same thing that lioness felt when she sat down next to the oryx calf. Something that looked an awful lot like love, even if neither of them had a word for it. Here is where the ancient mythology comes into the story. Because the human fascination with animals raising children across species lines is old enough to have produced some of the most enduring stories in all of human culture. The legend of Romulus and Remus, twin infants abandoned on the banks of the Tiber River and suckled by a she-wolf before being rescued by a shepherd, is the founding myth of Rome. The most powerful civilization in the ancient Western world traced its origin directly to an act of interspecies adoption. A wolf that chose to nurse human infants rather than ignore them or treat them as prey. This story did not emerge arbitrarily. It emerged from a cultural world in which the relationship between humans and animals was intimate enough, and the impulse of animals to care for helpless young was well documented enough that it served as a plausible and resonant foundation rather than an obvious absurdity. Ancient people had seen animals care for young that were not their own. They had witnessed the same interspecies care impulse that modern researchers are still trying to fully explain, and they found it significant enough to build their civilization's origin story around it. The mythology of children raised by animals appears independently across multiple ancient cultures with no connection to each other. Mowgli and the Wolves of the Jungle. Book draw from Indian oral traditions. The she-wolf of Rome is Mediterranean. Bear children appear in Polish and Scandinavian traditions. These stories are not borrowings from a single source. They are independent expressions of the same cultural observation, that the boundary between human young and animal young is porous in the specific context of helplessness, and that animals will sometimes choose to care across that boundary when the circumstances are right. The circumstances, as modern research has established, involve oxytocin and infant cues and a care system that fires broadly rather than narrowly. They involve the practice benefits of caregiving experience and the social returns of prosocial behavior. And they may involve something that is harder to quantify but increasingly difficult to deny, a genuine emotional responsiveness to the vulnerability and suffering of another creature that operates across species lines in the large-brained social animals that have been sharing this planet with us for millions of years. Here is the conclusion that the entire picture builds toward, and it is worth stating clearly. The capacity for care that extends beyond genetic self-interest, beyond your own offspring, beyond your own species, beyond any return that strict evolutionary accounting would predict, appears to be one of the oldest features of large-brained social animal cognition. It is not something that humans invented and that other animals accidentally stumble into on occasion. It appears across gorillas, dolphins, elephants, capuchin monkeys, lions, eagles, and dozens of other species with enough consistency that it looks less like error and more like capacity. It shows up in ancient humans taking wolf pups into their camps and forming bonds that eventually transformed those wolves into dogs, the first and longest domestication relationship in the history of our species. It shows up in the myths that ancient cultures built around animals raising human children, preserving the observation that this kind of cross-species care was real and significant long before anyone had the scientific vocabulary to explain why it happened. It shows up in modern people paying veterinary bills for animals that share none of their genes, grieving for pets that have died, and experiencing genuine happiness in the company of creatures that evolution would say they have no particular reason to care about. The wires crossed somewhere deep in the evolution of large-brained social animals. The care response became sensitive enough to infant cues that it reached beyond its original target, and everything that followed. Every dog that has ever loved a human, every human that has ever loved a dog, every lion that has ever sat next to an oryx calf in the dry grass of an African savanna and chosen, for reasons that no evolutionary theory has yet perfectly explained, to protect rather than consume, all of it flows from that same ancient, imprecise, beautiful misfiring of a system that was built for one thing and keeps finding others. The system was built for offspring. It keeps choosing more.